Barron Trump, a quiet and towering teenager standing over 6 feet tall, sat by the window in first class, engrossed in a hardcover book. The flight from Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport to Newark was fully booked, and the cabin was abuzz with the usual mix of pre-flight chatter and mild chaos. Barron, despite his recognizable name, seemed intent on avoiding attention, his calm demeanor suggesting he wished to blend in. Meanwhile, in the economy section, an elderly man in his late 70s shuffled down the aisle, clutching a weathered leather duffel bag. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, and his military jacket adorned with faded patches and medals silently narrated a life of service and sacrifice. Passengers watched him pass with quiet admiration, some whispering among themselves about the stories his appearance might hold. He eventually found his seat near the rear, wedged between a restless toddler and a talkative businessman. As the flight attendants ensured everyone was seated and prepared for takeoff, a commotion erupted near the veteran. His seatmate was insistent on switching seats, causing discomfort and drawing glances from other passengers. The elderly man, ever polite, apologized for the inconvenience, but the scene caught Barron's attention from the front of the plane. Pausing from his reading, Barron leaned slightly into the aisle, his brow furrowed in thought. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When she arrived, he spoke softly yet firmly. "Excuse me, can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant, momentarily stunned by the unexpected request, nodded and went to relay the offer. First-class passengers looked up from their devices, whispering among themselves about the young Trump's surprising gesture. A woman seated across from him leaned over and said, "You don't have to do that. You paid for this seat." Barron simply smiled, shrugged, and replied, "Some people deserve it more." The attendant returned moments later, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and surprise. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron. Without a second thought, Barron stood, grabbed his carry-on bag, and began making his way to the back of the plane. Passengers watched in silence, their expressions a mix of astonishment and respect. As Barron passed the rows of economy seats, whispers followed him. His act of selflessness, especially coming from someone in his position, struck a chord with everyone on board. When he reached the veteran, he offered a polite smile and quietly took the cramped seat in the back. The atmosphere of the flight shifted entirely. What began as an ordinary journey was now imbued with a sense of unity and reverence. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, and even the usual in-flight chatter softened, replaced by a quiet admiration for the teenager who had just shown a remarkable example of humility and respect. Barron Trump's small yet powerful gesture left a lasting impression on everyone on that flight, a reminder that true character often reveals itself in unexpected moments. As the flight settled into its rhythm, the passengers couldn't stop glancing between Barron Trump in the economy section and the elderly veteran now seated comfortably in first class. The murmurs of admiration had not quieted, and the atmosphere on the plane remained charged with an unspoken reverence. The veteran, now sipping water and staring out of the window, seemed contemplative. His hands rested on his lap, the faint tremor revealing the emotions brewing within him. After a moment, he turned to the middle-aged woman seated beside him, her kind eyes curious but attentive. "I need to say something," the veteran began, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the hum of the engines. He adjusted the small purple heart pin on his lapel, his fingers lingering on the metal as though it carried the weight of the story he was about to share. "That young man who gave me this seat," he said, nodding toward the economy section where Barron sat absorbed in his book. "His family saved my life once." The woman blinked, visibly surprised. "His family?" she asked, leaning closer, her interest piqued. The veteran nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Years ago, during my service, I was injured badly in the field. My unit was ambushed, and we were outnumbered. I thought I wouldn't make it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But it was a young medic who found me, stabilized me, and carried me to safety under fire. He risked his life for mine." The woman's eyes widened, and she glanced back toward Barron, who remained unaware of the growing attention. "That medic," the veteran continued, was Donald Trump's uncle, Dr. John Trump, a brilliant man and a brave soul. He didn't just save my life, he gave me a second chance. As the veteran's story unfolded, the passengers nearby began to listen intently, the quiet hum of the cabin now filled with a sense of awe. The middle-aged woman placed a hand on her heart. "That's incredible," she whispered. "I've never met the young man before today," the veteran added, his voice cracking slightly. "But when I saw his name, I knew who he was. And now, after what he's done for me, I see that courage and kindness run in his family." Word of the revelation quickly spread through the cabin, and the mood shifted once more. Passengers exchanged glances, some visibly moved, others reaching for tissues as the significance of the moment sank in. Barron, unaware of the growing whispers, remained engrossed in his book, seemingly content in his cramped economy seat. Yet his selfless act had rippled far beyond what he could have anticipated, weaving a story that united the passengers in a shared sense of admiration and respect. As the flight soared through the clouds, the veteran leaned back in his seat, his gaze once again turning toward the young man who had reminded him of humanity's capacity for kindness. For everyone on that plane, it was clear. This was a moment they would not soon forget. The cabin of the plane had grown noticeably quieter, the usual hum of conversations replaced by the soft weight of the veteran's words. His story had drawn in passengers like a magnet, turning a routine flight into something extraordinary. The veteran leaned back in his seat, his voice steadier now as he continued. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family to lean on. I got injured, shot twice in the leg. When I finally made it stateside, I felt lost. No purpose, no direction. I drifted for a long time." His voice wavered briefly, but he pressed on. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a place to stay, and I barely had money for food. One day, I was outside a diner, struggling, wondering if I could keep going. That's when a man stopped to talk to me." Passengers leaned in closer, their attention fully captured. Even those in first class had turned their heads to listen. The veteran's expression grew wistful. "He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat down with me, asked me about my story. That man was Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father." Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers, and a middle-aged woman seated next to the veteran placed a hand over her heart. "Fred Trump?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. The veteran nodded, his gaze distant, lost in the memory. "Yes, he didn't owe me anything, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to help me get back on my feet. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just said, 'You serve this country. It's the least we can do.'" His voice broke slightly. "I've never forgotten that." The story spread quickly through the cabin, murmurs of amazement flowing from row to row. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Even the flight attendants paused in their duties, drawn to the unfolding narrative. "I always wanted to thank his family," the veteran continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But life moved on, and I thought the chance was lost. And now, today, Fred Trump's grandson, he's given me a gift I'll never forget. What are the odds of something like this happening?" In the economy section, Barron remained oblivious to the growing buzz around him. His long legs were awkwardly folded into the cramped seat, his focus entirely on the book in his hands. But in first class, the passengers were deeply moved. A flight attendant leaned down and whispered to the veteran, "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his peace. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me, not right now." The atmosphere in the cabin felt electric, as if every passenger had been bound together by the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just about Barron's gesture anymore. It was about the ripple effects of kindness across generations. Breaking the silence, a man seated across from the veteran leaned forward. He looked to be in his early 40s with a face that carried both weariness and warmth. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, his voice steady but emotional. But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam, too. He used to say how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, that's rare, too rare. The veteran smiled faintly, nodding. It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over, but that one act gave me hope when I needed it most. The man nodded, visibly moved. Around them, other passengers began sharing their own quiet reflections in hushed tones. The flight, once an ordinary journey, had transformed into something profound, a shared moment of humanity. And as the plane soared through the sky, every passenger seemed to carry the weight of the story with them, a reminder of how the smallest gestures could ripple through time, changing lives in ways no one could ever predict. The flight attendant's words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with significance. Barron's calm expression shifted, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed what she had said. My grandfather? He repeated, his tone soft but curious. The attendant nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Yes. The gentleman told us that decades ago, after serving in Vietnam, he returned home injured and struggling to rebuild his life. One day your grandfather saw him outside a diner in New York. Instead of just walking by, he stopped, listened to his story, and gave him the help he needed to get back on his feet. He said your grandfather gave him a second chance at life. Barron's gaze dropped for a moment, thoughtful. He seemed to weigh the words carefully before looking back at the attendant. I didn't know that, he admitted, his voice quieter now. The attendant's smile grew warmer. Well, he wanted you to know how much what you did today meant to him. He said your gesture reminded him of your grandfather's kindness, and it brought everything full circle. Barron sat back in his seat, his tall frame folding slightly as he absorbed the revelation. Around him, passengers were still stealing glances, their admiration evident. Despite the attention, Barron remained composed, though a hint of emotion flickered in his eyes. Across the cabin, the veteran, unaware of the conversation taking place, continued to stare out the window, his thoughts seemingly far away. The ripple effect of gratitude and kindness was tangible now, weaving its way through every corner of the plane. As the plane touched down at Newark, the energy in the cabin felt transformed. The usual rush to unbuckle seatbelts and grab carry-ons was replaced by a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Passengers lingered in their seats, exchanging smiles and nods as if silently acknowledging the profound moment they had shared. When the doors opened, Barron stood, his book tucked under one arm, and moved toward the front of the plane. As he passed the veteran, their eyes met. The elderly man stood, extending his hand. Thank you, the veteran said simply, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Barron shook his hand firmly, offering a small, genuine smile. No, thank you, he replied, his words carrying a weight that belied his youth. The passengers watched as the two exchanged a quiet moment of mutual respect, their connection symbolic of something greater, an unbroken chain of kindness spanning generations. As they stepped off the plane, each person carried with them a renewed sense of humanity, inspired by the simple but profound acts of generosity that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. The veteran's heartfelt words seemed to linger in the air as he walked away, leaving Barron standing in quiet reflection. Passengers filed out of the plane, many pausing to exchange brief words with Barron, offering smiles, handshakes, and subtle nods of admiration. Some even whispered, "Thank you," not just for his gesture, but for the humanity it had sparked in everyone on board. At the baggage claim, the atmosphere was still charged with a sense of connectedness. The usual hustle and bustle felt subdued, as if each person carried a piece of the story in their heart. Barron waited for his luggage, his tall frame distinct, but his presence understated. As he glanced at his phone, he typed the message. Grandpa would have been proud of today, hesitating momentarily before pressing send. His mother's reply came quickly. He would have been very proud, and so are we. Barron slipped his phone into his pocket and turned to leave, As he walked toward the exit, a little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mom, that's the guy from the plane," she smiled, bending down to whisper, "Yes, that's the young man who reminded us all what kindness looks like." The story didn't end there. By the time the passengers left the airport, the tale of Barron Trump's selfless act and its connection to his grandfather had begun to spread. It appeared in a local news article, then on social media, where it resonated with thousands, quickly becoming a symbol of how one seemingly small act of kindness could ripple outward, inspiring countless others. For Barron, it wasn't about the attention. As he stepped into the car waiting for him outside, he looked out at the world beyond, feeling a quiet pride, not for himself, but for continuing a legacy of compassion he had only just begun to fully understand. And for everyone who had been on that flight, it became a story they would tell for years, a reminder of how one moment could bridge generations, heal wounds, and spark hope in even the most unexpected places.